Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Forest Hills, Queens, April 16th, 2022. A Saturday morning in one of New York City's quietest neighborhoods. Parents walking dogs, children heading to soccer practice, commuters waiting for trains. On Juno Street, rows of tidy homes stand close together, the kind of community where neighbors wave and rarely expect police sirens. But that morning, everything changed. Just after 8 a.m., a dog walker noticed something out of place on Metropolitan Avenue near the edge of Forest Park. A sports duffel sat against the curb. At first, it looked like equipment left behind after a late-night game, but the bag was smeared with blood. The walker reached for a phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, patrol units arrived. They opened the bag, confirmed human remains, and immediately established a perimeter. The discovery shocked even seasoned first responders. They began searching the immediate area, following a faint but visible trail of blood across sidewalks and streets. That trail led them directly back to a residence on Juno Street only blocks away. Inside the home, officers found signs of violence, but what stood out most was what they didn't find: no forced entry. The locks, the doors, and the windows appeared intact. That detail shifted the focus. Whoever had been inside likely had access. It suggested the victim might have known her attacker. The victim was identified as 51-year-old Orsolya Gal, a mother of two. She lived in that Juno Street house with her family. Court records and contemporaneous media would later confirm she had been out the night before, returning home after midnight. The timeline placed her back at the residence around 12:30 a.m. Hours later, someone was seen wheeling the duffel down neighborhood sidewalks at approximately 4:15 a.m. That footage became an anchor point for investigators. Forensic technicians began their standard process. They documented the scene, logged the duffel and its contents into chain of custody, and canvassed the neighborhood for surveillance video. Detectives from the 112th Precinct were quickly reassigned to major case duty, given the brutality and public exposure of the crime. One detective later remarked that the data aligned too cleanly. The blood trail was direct, the timing of the surveillance video matched perfectly, and yet too many hours were unaccounted for inside the residence. Between 12:30 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., nearly 4 hours of silence, a dark interval, left room for both speculation and further investigation. By noon that day, news crews had gathered outside Juno Street. Residents, who only hours earlier expected a typical Saturday, now watched as crime scene tape and forensic vans closed off their block. Parents were seen ushering children back inside. Interviews conducted later captured a shared sentiment: disbelief that a violent crime could occur in such a suburban setting, just steps away from their homes. The first response phase ended with clear takeaways. The victim had been killed inside her own home. The body had been moved using a bag from that same house. There were no signs of forced entry, and a critical window of time, nearly 4 hours, demanded answers. Investigators now faced two pressing questions: who had access to the home without forcing entry, and why would someone risk wheeling a bloodied bag down public streets before dawn? The transfer begins at the loading bay of the Office of Chief Medical Examiner. The remains arrive sealed, photographed, and logged under the same Queens case number issued at the residence. Evidence custodians confirm intact tamper seals, countersign the chain of custody, and move the body to a restricted intake suite. From this point forward, every action is time-stamped and attributable. Identification procedures start with full-frame photography as received, then a second pass after surface cleaning. Distinctive features are recorded for the file: scars, marks, prior surgical sites, so next-of-kin confirmation can rely on documentation rather than exposure. Personal effects, if present, are itemized under separate property envelopes. The intake checklist is mechanical by design. It prevents gaps a defense can exploit later. The external exam focuses on pattern, not drama. Multiple sharp force injuries are measured with metric rulers and angle indicators. Each wound gets a unique label, length estimate, and orientation notation: parallel, oblique, intersecting. Neck involvement is documented with attention to vascular compromise. Smaller cuts to hands and forearms are assessed for features consistent with defensive movement. Areas of overlapping injury are diagrammed so sequencing can be addressed where possible. Wound photography proceeds with scale and color standards to preserve admissibility. Swabbing follows a fixed order to minimize cross-contamination: hands, oral cavity, neck, and any obvious contact points. Fingernails are clipped or scraped into sterile paper folds. Each fold is labeled with the case number and site. These samples will be compared later to reference standards obtained under warrant. Blood is drawn for toxicology, alcohols, sedatives, analgesics, and targeted screens if clinically indicated. A clean toxicology panel does not change cause or manner, it simply narrows variables. Clothing associated with the body is treated as a separate scene. Garments are air-dried and packaged in paper, not plastic, to protect biologicals. Cut defects on fabric are mapped against the anatomic wound chart. When a slit in clothing aligns with an underlying penetration, that concordance supports orientation and weapon characteristics. Transfer patterns, smear, wipe, compression, are photographed with scale, then sketched to show probable contact direction. Any foreign fibers are taped off with low-tack methods and stored for later comparison against items recovered outside the residence. The internal exam clarifies lethality. A standard Y incision exposes chest and abdominal cavities. Deep hemorrhage along wound tracts confirms antemortem trauma. The neck dissection is performed to document vascular injury and airway compromise. In this case record, the pattern supports fatal sharp force injury with neck involvement. There is no speculation about motive from the table. The medical examiner speaks to mechanism and manner, not why it happened. Time since death is bracketed, not guessed. Core temperature, rigor, and liver findings are recorded, then handed back to the investigative team for correlation with the residential timeline already established. Known return home shortly after midnight is one anchor. A pre-dawn removal captured on neighborhood video is another. Pathology provides the physiological window. Cameras and logs refine it. Trace collection continues after the internal exam. Hair combings and pubic standards, as indicated by policy, oral swabs, and any visible foreign debris are preserved. If adhesive lifts capture fibers inconsistent with the victim's environment, those will be compared to outerwear recovered along a mapped route near Forest Park. The morgue does not adjudicate that match. It preserves the possibility of it with clean technique. The report language is clinical: cause of death, sharp force injuries, manner of death, homicide. Preliminary status moves to confirmed when histology and all lab work clear. That single word, confirmed, matters. It is the difference between an initial impression and an opinion that can withstand cross-examination. Victim care is procedural and humane at the same time. The OCME coordinates with the victim advocate and the precinct detective team for next of kin notifications. Documentation includes release conditions to funeral services and a hold on any garment or item required for trial. Families want clarity without spectacle. The paperwork, precise and dry, exists so a survivor never has to learn later that evidence was lost to poor packaging or an avoidable chain break. From an investigative standpoint, this chapter adds leverage, not headlines. The wound map can support or contradict later statements about struggle, weapon type, and attack sequence. If someone claims a single panicked strike, clustered penetrations with varying angles and depths say otherwise. If someone asserts the assault happened outdoors, the absence of soil or vegetative debris embedded in clothing undermines that account. The morgue does not name a suspect. It narrows the set of stories a person can credibly tell. Samples, photographs, and clothing now move on sign transfer to the lab for DNA and serology. Touch DNA under nails, if present, will be compared to reference standards when legally obtained. Blood pattern interpretations inside the residence will be expected to align with the injury distribution documented here. If the residence patterns and the wound chart disagree, scene reconstruction must explain why. Otherwise, the weaker narrative is discarded. The data align too cleanly, one detective noted earlier. The correct answer to that concern is to verify alignment across independent systems, biology, scene stains, and digital timing. Then keep only what co-varies. There is a community line worth stating once. In neighborhoods like Forest Hills, murders aren't just crimes, they disrupt the baseline of routine. A careful autopsy restores order in the only way available to the living, facts measured, preserved, and ready for court. By the end of this phase, the case file gains durable structure, confirmed cause and manner, a defensible time window compatible with residential events, clothing to wound concordance, complete biological sampling, and tight chain of custody. The next step is straightforward. The primary scene must be processed to either agree with or challenge what the body has already said. The blood trail leading back to Juno Street meant investigators had no choice but to treat the home itself as a full crime scene. Detectives and forensic technicians entered only after the residence was cleared and warrants secured. Everything from the front gate to the basement stairwell became subject to grid search. The key question was simple. Did the violence originate inside the home? And if so, how was it carried out without drawing attention in a quiet Forest Hills neighborhood? Entry points were the first concern. Door locks showed no sign of tampering, no pry marks, no broken frames. Windows on the first floor were intact, security screens undisturbed. That absence of forced entry pushed investigators toward a limited set of explanations. Either the victim had allowed someone inside or the person already had legitimate access. Both scenarios narrowed potential suspects dramatically. Inside, luminol and alternate light sources highlighted patterns not visible to the naked eye. Stains consistent with cast-off and contact transfer were located on flooring near the stairwell and on portions of the basement wall. Each pattern was photographed with scale, logged, and given a working interpretation, projected blood versus smear versus transfer. Confirmed spatter arcs suggested repeated sharp force motion. Investigators knew that the morgue's wound mapping would eventually need to align with these trajectories. Physical trace collection followed. Fibers recovered from a sofa cushion and a kitchen rug were sealed separately. A pair of latex gloves, discarded in a trash receptacle, were logged and packaged for DNA testing. Footwear impressions faintly visible in drying blood were photographed with oblique lighting and then lifted with gelatin. Preliminary examinations suggested a sneaker-type outsole, but until comparison with known shoes was possible, it remained only a working note. Neighboring CCTV feeds were canvassed. A doorbell camera across the street showed faint movement in the hours before dawn, a figure wheeling a duffel bag along Metropolitan Avenue. Resolution was limited, but the posture and timing were valuable. Another camera captured a glimpse of the same bag crossing an intersection toward Forest Park. That visual evidence confirmed the removal route already traced by officers earlier. Each digital clip was timestamped, preserved on Right Once Media, and backed up for integrity. Vehicle processing extended beyond the house. Detectives inspected the family SUV parked in the driveway. No immediate signs of transport were visible, no large stains, no foreign debris, but swabs were still taken from interior panels, door handles, and the trunk liner. Negative evidence matters. If the vehicle shows no traces, it prevents later claims that the transport occurred by car. The absence itself becomes a fact. In the basement, investigators collected a kitchen knife consistent with a potential weapon. Its blade length approximated some of the injuries documented at autopsy. The knife bore reddish-brown staining and was immediately packaged for serology and DNA testing. Whether this knife proved to be the confirmed weapon would depend on lab analysis, but its presence inside the residence carried obvious significance. One detective noted quietly that the alignment between the spatter arcs, the recovered knife, and the victim's wound chart might either clarify the attack sequence or raise new contradictions. The data aligned too cleanly, he said, meaning the story had to be tested, not assumed. Clean matches can mislead if evidence from different sources is forced together. The wider community context mattered as well. Forest Hills is not a high-crime district. Residents reported hearing little more than routine nighttime noise. That silence underscored the unsettling fact. Violence of this scale had unfolded indoors, in a home steps away from families still asleep. In neighborhoods like this, the expectation of safety is high. The breach of it carries weight beyond one family. By the close of scene processing, detectives had logged intact entry points, blood patterns inside the home, a probable knife, footwear impressions, and surveillance footage establishing removal of the duffel. No single item closed the case, but together they built the architecture of proof. The next step would be to compare these findings against digital records, call logs, texts, and carrier data to see who could be placed inside the house at the right time. From the moment the residence was secured, the next move was to lock the clock with sources that don't forget: cameras, point-of-sale timestamps, and carrier records. The bar where Orsolia Gal was seen late that Friday ran a standard POS system. Transaction logs confirmed a small tab closed not long before midnight, with a receipt time that aligned with staff statements and exterior CCTV showing her leaving alone. That exit time matters because it hardens the front edge of the home arrival window. Residential footage in Forest Hills then captured her street return around 12:30. The entry image is partial, but the timestamp matches the route she would have walked from the station and through her block. The most consequential piece of video is still the pre-dawn clip, a lone figure wheeling a sports duffel along neighborhood sidewalks around 4:15 a.m. Detectives pulled the original files, secured the native metadata, and mirrored them to Right Once Media. The footage was then mapped against a simple route model from Juno Street to Metropolitan Avenue near Union Turnpike. Even allowing for pauses and obstacles, the timing fit. When investigators overlaid that route with the earlier blood trail documented by first responders, the indoor-to-curb sequence held up without needing any guesswork. Carrier data came next. For a 2022 crime, call detail records and tower activity provide presence windows even without handset GPS. Analysts reviewed the victim's device events and noted a pattern. Ordinary activity earlier in the evening, normal idle while she was in the bar, confirmation of service once she returned home, and then a sustained lull until morning. Where the record shows silence, the report calls it what it is, a dark interval. The absence doesn't prove an assault on its own. It simply removes the distraction of unrelated notifications or movement pings. Investigators also flagged a message sent from the victim's device later that night, after the probable assault window had already opened. According to contemporaneous reporting, the language read as out of character and was treated as possible staging. The phone's own logs become crucial here. Who had physical possession when that message was typed? And does the typing cadence or autocorrect history match the known user? Those are technical questions for examiners, not assumptions for a jury. Until attribution is clean, the message sits in the file as a working lead. Financials can corroborate the clock without reaching for motive. The bar's closing receipt supports departure time. No unusual cash withdrawals appear in the immediate window. If the household account shows routine purchases earlier in the week and nothing between home arrival and morning response, that's a neutral data point that neither expands nor contradicts the timeline. Where financials do help is in narrowing who could afford to be awake and mobile at 4 in the morning without drawing attention. Transit entries, rideshare activity, or card taps can leave footprints. Here, the absence of a rideshare record consistent with the removal suggests a pedestrian route, already captured on video. Doorbell cameras from adjacent streets added small but reliable fragments: a shadow crossing an intersection, a wheeled bag clipping a curb, a silhouette moving at a steady pace. Each clip on its own is modest. Together they replicate the path from the home to the curb. Analysts synchronized camera clocks against a reference time server so that a minute in one file equals a minute in another. That eliminates a common defense argument, that household devices drift and can't be trusted to line up. The reconstruction stands on aligned clocks. The digital review also protects against convenient narratives. With no sign of forced entry at the residence and no evidence the family vehicle was used for transport, the tech stack keeps the story honest. If someone later claims a stranger arrived by car and fled, the video grid and vehicle negative swabs argue against it. If someone suggests a prolonged argument in the street, the cameras, quiet, impartial, don't show it. What remains after this pass is a tight window, home around 12:30 a.m., removal before 4:15 a.m. Discovery just after 8 a.m. The margin for alternative explanations is small, and that is by design. Digital evidence does not accuse, it excludes. In neighborhoods like Forest Hills, that matters. People want to know whether the timeline has room for doubt, or whether it collapses to a short list of access holders whose presence can be tested against the clock. One careful thought to take with you. If a message from the victim's phone appears after the timeline goes dark, is it more likely she sent it, or that someone with immediate access to both her and her device did? The next step is interviews and statement analysis, lining up what people say with what the cameras and carriers have already fixed. As the digital trail tightened, detectives turned to the next indispensable layer, what people said and how it measured against what the record had already fixed. Officers began with immediate family. The victim's husband, who was out of state on a business trip, provided a sworn itinerary backed by carrier records, boarding passes, and hotel invoices. His location data and independent witnesses confirmed absence. Their two sons, both at home that night, were questioned separately with guardians present. Their accounts of being asleep, woken later by officers, matched the known timeline, and no digital evidence contradicted their placement in the house. These interviews, though routine, established a baseline: who had access, who did not, and whose story was supported by corroborating data. Detectives then extended outward. Neighbors recalled little noise, no arguments, and no sign of strangers loitering near Juno Street. Their doorbell cameras aligned with the path already seen on other feeds: a lone figure moving steadily with a duffel. Witness testimony here served mostly as negative evidence. It reinforced the quiet of the block, the absence of shouts, alarms, or forced entry, making it harder to claim an intruder stormed the home undetected. Investigators also contacted friends and social contacts. Some described the victim, Orsolya Gal, as outgoing and sociable, noting she had spent that Friday evening at a local bar. One witness confirmed she closed her tab near midnight, which was already documented through receipts and footage. Another mentioned she sometimes shared personal frustrations, though none recalled recent threats or disputes that would explain the escalation to lethal violence. These statements, while anecdotal, provided context but did not alter the established timeline. The most critical step in this phase was comparing voluntary statements from an identified acquaintance to the hard record. According to police reports, one man admitted to knowing the victim well and offered partial recollections about his contact with her. Detectives quickly tested his version against the phone logs, text messages, and the video timeline. Inconsistencies emerged. Claimed departure times did not match surveillance, and the explanation for certain late-night messages diverged from the digital pattern. Each discrepancy was logged as a working inconsistency, not proof on its own, but a pressure point to be tested in later interrogations. Even minor details were scrutinized. How someone described the victim's mood, or whether they mentioned a bag being moved, could later be compared with confirmed forensic findings. Small shifts in wording, like referring to going out when records showed she was already home, gave investigators reason to keep probing. Forensic linguistics teams often flag these irregularities, not as final evidence, but as leads to follow with renewed focus. Throughout this stage, detectives avoided tunnel vision. Every interview was documented, transcribed, and checked against the same fixed markers: midnight bar departure, home entry around 12:30 a.m., dark digital interval, and movement of a duffel before dawn. Any claim falling outside those bookends was treated with caution. This method prevented the narrative from drifting or becoming dependent on speculation. In procedural crime work, statements serve two main purposes. They can confirm a record, or they can fracture against it. In this case, most family and neighbor statements supported what technology already showed, while one set of remarks raised more questions than answers. Investigators flagged these contradictions for follow-up, ensuring the voice of the suspect would eventually be weighed against hard data. For audiences following true crime stories, one question often lingers. When digital records are this precise, why do investigators still push so hard on interviews? The reason is simple. Devices show where people were. Words reveal how they try to frame it. That gap between movement and story often tells the real truth. With the clocks aligned and statements tested, the next move was to determine what, if anything, was prepared in advance versus grabbed in the moment. Detectives started with inventory from the residence. The wheeled sports duffel tied to removal appeared to be household property, not a newly acquired item. The knife recovered inside the home fit the autopsy's wound profile by length and edge characteristics. Lab work would decide whether it was the confirmed weapon, but nothing in receipts suggested a recent purchase resembling that blade. In other words, the tools necessary for the crime were already on hand. No shopping trail to follow, no packaging to trace, nothing that widened the suspect pool through retail surveillance. That absence shifted focus to movement artifacts outside the house. According to contemporaneous media and police reports, officers recovered a jacket and bloodied tissues along the mapped route toward Forest Park. Each item was photographed in situ, packaged separately, and booked under the Queen's case number. Swabs and tape lifts were taken for DNA and fiber comparison against samples preserved at the morgue and collected from the residence. If the fabric fibers from the jacket matched trace inside the home, or if touch DNA in the jacket lining aligned with a person of interest, the route would transform from suggestive to evidentiary. Financial records were reviewed for corroboration rather than motive. The bar receipt and ordinary household transactions framed a normal week leading into the night. No hardware store purchases, no late-night rideshare charges consistent with transport, no cash withdrawals that altered the timing. When investigators looked for procurement, they found logistics instead, the practicality of a bag with wheels, a route with minimal lighting before dawn, and a park edge that offered cover for disposal. Planning, if it existed, was tactical rather than commercial, choosing a path and time rather than buying tools. Medical documentation added a critical layer. According to police filings and contemporaneous reporting, a person of interest sought treatment for hand lacerations shortly after the incident window. Detectives obtained records through legal process, noting the stated cause of injury and the treatment time. Sharp, defensive wounds can produce cuts on an assailant. The autopsy's injury distribution made that medically plausible. If any bandage adhesive or gauze fibers later correlated with materials found along the route, the chain would tighten further. Even without that, the timing of treatment mattered. Coming hours after a violent event, it required an explanation that would stand against the digital timeline. Surveillance near pharmacies and clinics was quietly checked to place or exclude suspects around the medical visit. Where cameras existed, analysts synchronized device clocks as they had with the road footage. If a face or gait matched prior captures near Juno Street, that would add continuity without leaning on a single angle. Investigators avoided overreach. A clinic arrival alone doesn't prove involvement, but paired with hand injuries and the pre-dawn wheeling clip, it becomes a strand in a braided proof. What emerged was not a shopping list, but a sequence. Household tools, a practical container, a pedestrian route the cameras could verify, and medical attention that lined up with the risk profile of close-contact sharp force homicide. In neighborhoods like Forest Hills, routine is the baseline. Planning can be as simple as exploiting what a house and a quiet block already provide. The human point is stark but useful. When a community expects safety, investigators have to prove not just what was used, but how ordinary objects became instruments of harm. The next procedural step is charging theory, translating converging lines of physical, digital, and testimonial evidence into counts a prosecutor can carry into court. Once investigators consolidated the forensic trail, home entry, digital voids, route evidence, and medical records, the task turned to translating facts into charges a court could sustain. According to police reports filed in Queens County, the district attorney's team weighed the degree of homicide supported by the record. The autopsy confirmed sharp force injuries consistent with intentional assault, while statements from neighbors and acquaintances narrowed motive toward personal conflict rather than opportunistic burglary. Negative evidence, such as the absence of forced entry and the familiarity of movement inside the residence, indicated that the assailant was not a stranger. With probable cause established, prosecutors prepared for second-degree murder as the core charge alongside criminal possession of a weapon. The theory was supported by chain of custody items: the household knife consistent with wound depth, the wheeled duffel linked to transport, and the clothing discarded along Metropolitan Avenue. Each piece had its own lab report and booking entry, ensuring admissibility once challenged in pre-trial. Interagency roles were limited but critical. NYPD detectives led the investigation, while state forensic labs expedited DNA and fiber comparisons. Because of the public nature of the route, federal crime databases were also queried for trace hits, though none produced additional suspects. Coordination between the precinct, homicide bureau, and Queens DA's office allowed the warrant applications to proceed without delay. Reward discussions surfaced briefly as the community reacted to the violence in Forest Hills. Flyers circulated, tip lines stayed active, but the converging forensic record meant the case was not dependent on outside witnesses. Prosecutors emphasized that the evidence was internally corroborating. Medical timing, surveillance alignment, and forensic consistency each pointed in one direction. From a narrative perspective, charging theory reflects more than statute. It demonstrates how ordinary investigative layers, once stacked, create a framework sturdy enough to stand in court. Communities watch this moment closely. It marks the transition from open suspicion to formal accountability. The next procedural stage is pretrial, where evidence faces challenges of suppression, admissibility, and defense counter-theories before a jury is ever seated. With the forensic strands aligned, timestamps, root footage, autopsy findings, and medical documentation, the file moved from reconstruction to courtroom posture. Prosecutors in Queens County began by stress testing admissibility. The recorded statements the suspect gave to detectives, the seized items booked under chain of custody, and the synchronized camera exports with verified metadata. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, the interview memorialized the suspect's account of an argument inside the Juno Street residence, a sharp force assault, and the pre-dawn removal using a household duffel. The state prepared to show that the statement followed standard advisements and that it tracked independently with the timeline already fixed by video and carrier activity. Defense counsel assessed the same terrain from the opposite direction. If a suppression motion could exclude the defendant's words or narrow the forensic field, leverage improves. But the lab-to-scene continuity was intact. The root artifacts were photographed in situ and matched the mapped path toward Metropolitan Avenue. The autopsy's wound profile was consistent with the household knife recovered. Even without leaning on the interview, the physical, digital, and corroborating testimony formed a closed loop. In pre-trial conference, the court addressed bail and public safety concerns. Given the gravity of the offense and the strength of the evidence as presented, custody remained in place pending resolution. At this stage, prosecutors refined charging language around intentional fatal conduct with a weapon, while defense weighed exposure at trial against the certainty of a negotiated outcome. The legal question was no longer what happened. The record had already narrowed that window, but how the law should classify it and what sentence the facts could support. In practical terms, that means looking at risk at trial, the predictability of jury reception when surveillance and autopsy converge, and the cost to the victim's family of prolonging litigation. The pivot came when the defendant opted to plead guilty to manslaughter in the first degree, as reflected in court filings reported at the time. A plea is not an abstract. It has to live inside the evidence. The narrative accepted by the court, the late-night argument, the lethal sequence inside the home, the removal along the same path cameras had already captured, did not require speculation, only the alignment of admissions to what the silent records had shown from the start. The plea avoided the need to seat a jury and call pathologists, lab analysts, and digital forensic specialists to repeat, piece by piece, what the clocks and swabs had already said. Sentencing followed with the structure typical to violent felonies in New York. The state argued for a term that reflected the brutality of a close-contact killing inside a residence and the post-incident conduct documented on video. The defense emphasized acceptance of responsibility and the certainty brought by the plea. The court imposed a determinate prison term of 25 years, consistent with contemporaneous reporting, and entered orders that closed the criminal matter on the record. In legal terms, the resolution was final. In human terms, it acknowledged the harm in the only way the system can, through custody and time. A final word on process matters for communities that follow crime closely. This outcome wasn't the result of a single smoking gun. It was the sum of clinical steps done correctly and in the right order, securing the residence, preserving video in native format, synchronizing clocks, documenting autopsy findings, tracing route artifacts, verifying medical treatment timing, and testing statements against fixed facts. When each layer corroborates the others, pressure points for reasonable doubt narrow. That is why routine police work, done precisely, often decides a case long before opening statements would have begun. There is also a human point that belongs in the record. Violence in private spaces rarely announces itself. It unfolds in rooms where neighbors hear nothing and cameras record only what passes outside. The practical takeaway for any community is not fear. It is attention, checking in on people we know, noticing abrupt changes, and using available services when relationships turn volatile. Justice arrived here through method, but prevention starts long before the method is needed. The legal file on this homicide now reads as a complete sequence: late-night return, fatal sharp force assault inside the home, pre-dawn removal along a documented path, arrest and admission, plea and sentence. There is no second ending and no competing version. The clocks, the science, and the court all land in the same place. As I close this story, I'm reminded that behind every crime file is a family forever changed and a community left asking how it could have been prevented. What I take from this case is simple but vital. We must learn to see the warning signs in our relationships and act before silence turns into tragedy. It's not only about law enforcement, it's about neighbors, friends, and loved ones watching out for each other. What do you think? Could early intervention have made a difference here? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. If this video resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next true crime story that matters.